Introducing ourselves. So, hello, welcome. My name is Maliha. I'm with the Department of Health, and today we'll be talking about COVID-19 community conversations, right? And again, thank you all for taking time out this lovely afternoon to join us for this. We're inviting you to conversations about mental health, equity, and resilience, and how we've all been impacted, right? Before we get started, I do want to ask you guys, how many of us have filled out these census? Who's filled out the census? You could put it in the chat or just, unmute yourself.
I have.
Oh, thank you, Natalie. Anybody else? That's awesome. All right, we got one person. I know there's more.
I had also too. Yeah, I
All
did it.
right, so we have some great New Yorkers. Thank you all for filling out the census. So today's conversation will see other reasons why census is important, but what the census does, it's not just keeping count of the population, it's how federal funding gets decided, right? So funding for schools, education, healthcare, a lot of it, even like during COVID, what states get more PPE, all of it is really determined by census information. And then even like, in Congress, how much political power each state gets, right? And last time this was done, only 60% of New Yorkers filled it out, which means 40% of New Yorkers were not accounted for in terms of funding, right? So very, very crucial we fill it out so we continue to get the resources that we deserve and that we need, really, really need, right? So if you've not filled it out, sorry, the link is my2020census.gov. My coworker Mimi will put it in the chat for you guys, but just want to remind you of that. With that being said, Mimi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mimi Chen. I'm also from New York City Health Department and Mental Hygiene. I'm also a trainer of mental health first aid. Welcome to be here, and hopefully you enjoy this presentation, okay? And by the way, Mali has one of the greatest trainer, and you guys are very lucky to have her here today. All right.
All right, thank you, Mimi. You're too kind. Mimi will be great here to support us during the chat. She'll also be doing registration, so she might reach out to you privately on chat. So if you do see her, feel free to respond. All right, so with that being said, before I even get started, I did want to take a collective moment of silence just because this year has been a lot. COVID has not been easy and it's impacted us on an individual level, but even on a global level, right? So let's take a collective moment of silence, please. All right. Thank you so much for joining us in that moment. So I do want to encourage everybody, if you guys can, to turn on your camera, just so if you only feel comfortable, I understand if you don't, but just so we could see each other, this is a conversation, right? We're talking about mental health and how our community is being impacted. Oh yeah, of course, you can take your time. And again, like I said, if you're not comfortable, that's also okay. We respect that. I did want to invite you guys to turn on your camera. All right, so we do have like about 9 people, well, with me and Mimi. Wonder where everyone's from. What borough is everybody at? Anybody from Queens?
Queens.
Okay, we got Queens. Any Brooklyn? Wow, I have never had a room without Brooklyn. There's always somebody. Nobody Brooklyn? Okay. Or you can put it in the chat if you are not able to share. Let me open the chat real quick. All right, any Brooklyns? No Brooklyn? How about the Bronx? Anybody from the Bronx? Wow, Queens is leading this one. Okay. Manhattan? Nobody? Wow, all right. All right, so we've got a Queens group here. All right, so let's get into this. So we're gonna talk about COVID. So just a heads up. So this is about expected to last about an hour. Sometimes we might go over time a little bit. We're expected to end at 4:30, let's say 4:35. I'm gonna go over a lot of information. There's gonna be a lot of data, but data is important, right? Data is how we understand what real facts are, and we're gonna talk about that. We're gonna talk about how our communities have been impacted. We're gonna see rates of data there, and then I personally like having question and answer throughout, but if not, we'll have a Q&A at the end if you want to bring up any concerns that you have. But I am always open to, if you just want to talk during the conversation, put it in the chat. Happy to answer questions. All right. All right, so let's get into it. What is our agenda? We'll talk about the value of communication, why we're having this conversation, and how the rates of COVID have impacted in BIPOC communities. So if anyone is not familiar with the term BIPOC, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. It's a term to be more inclusive, right? So we're trying to change our vocabulary to be more inclusive around marginalized communities. And then we'll talk about how do we build resilience together as a community? How do we seek help? What kind of resources? We're going to have a lot of resource sharing that Mimi will be happy to share in our chats. So, and then we'll recap at the end of it. So, why is this conversation important? Why are we here today? Why are you guys attending this, right? We recognize that COVID has impacted everybody in some way, right? Whether it's health, finance, families, so many ways it has disrupted not just us in New York, but as a community, as America, as the whole planet, right? Our mental health has been greatly impacted. And with that, I want you to recognize that if you feel like your mental health has been impacted, know that you're not alone and that it's not your burden to carry by yourself. We'll be sharing a lot of resources on how we can work through that. And we're seeing BIPOC have been affected much more disproportionately. And then we'll talk about how we could build resilience. We'll highlight some of the disparities and talk about how it's impacted specific ethnicities, healthcare, and again, sharing resources by each neighborhood. So let's break this down. The impact COVID has had in specifically New York City. So here we see some data. These are total cases, hospitalization, and deaths in New York City. Now, this data is as of August 23rd, 2020, and you can find updated data on our website at DOH-MH website on a daily basis. But what we're seeing here is over 228,000 cases in New York alone. And know that these cases aren't just individuals, right? They're families, there are neighbors, there are communities, right? With over 19,000 confirmed deaths. Confirmed deaths meaning these people had a positive COVID test. A lot of people, especially at the height of it in April, May, a lot of them, even if they had the same symptoms, didn't necessarily get tested, right? So the deaths could be much, much high over. We're seeing probable deaths accounting for over 4,000, right? So definitely New York City has suffered a great loss. We've been impacted in so many ways. And now when we break down these cases, we're seeing that there is a pattern. Everything's not always equal, right? We're seeing in this slide, if anyone's not able to view this slide, this slide shows us the graph broken down by 4 ethnic groups. We're seeing Asian Pacific, represented by the blue graph, white community represented by the orange, and then the gray is Hispanics, and the yellow is the Black or African American community. We're seeing a pattern that the Hispanic and Black communities have been disproportionately impacted much higher than the white or Asian counterparts, right? Now, while we talk about these disparities, what could possibly impacting these communities? So let's see what BIPOC communities we're seeing disparate conditions here. Healthcare insecurity, food insecurity, housing insecurity, economic instability. How is housing insecurity impacting someone's, safety in terms of COVID, right? It's a virus. But how we live, where we live has great impact on what is accessible to us in terms of healthcare, food, right? For example, housing. If somebody lives in a NYCHA building, they're on the 10th floor, right? They're on the 10th floor for NYCHA building and they have to get down, whatever reason. The only way really down is the elevator, and only one of the elevators working out of the 6, the others are broken. Now, if they're living on the 10th floor, they're probably not the only ones. And if that elevator is coming up every half an hour, every time they have to take the elevator, there's a line. Do you think this person living in this situation can socially distance at all time? No. The only other option is to wait another half an hour for the elevator, but there's no guarantee that the elevator will be empty, right? So literally where a person lives determines how much they can keep themselves safe. They can't just go into a penthouse in Manhattan to live in a bubble, right? So very much we're seeing an impact depending on whether or not they have access to safe housing. Healthcare is another one. I know in certain neighborhoods in the Bronx, what has happened is some of the clinics have been converted into testing centers. So people who used to go to those clinics for their regular healthcare now have to find elsewhere to go, right? That's another impact. That's another barrier they're having in terms of like access to safety in times of COVID. So these are all things that have highly impacted on where we live and the impact of COVID we're seeing. So now that these neighbors, these folks living in these neighborhoods are experiencing these disparities, they are experiencing trauma. So let's touch on trauma. Trauma is a big word. We've been hearing this a lot thrown around, right? So we're going to break down the different types of traumas communities experience or people. First up, we have acute trauma. Acute trauma is it's a direct trauma, which could be either physical or emotional. For example, if somebody's a victim of a hate crime because of their color of their skin, their religion, their sexual orientation, right? That is an example of acute trauma that's happening to that specific person, discrimination in that case. Then you have collective trauma. Now, collective trauma is something we're going through as a community. A whole community is experiencing it, right? For example, 9/11 was a collective trauma that New York faced as a whole. COVID is a collective trauma that New York is facing, but not just New York, the entire world is facing as a whole, right? So that's an example of collective trauma. Then we have secondary traumatic stress. Secondary traumatic stress is the emotional stress that somebody's experiencing by witnessing something traumatic. So even if I'm or somebody's not going through a trauma directly, just witnessing it can be traumatic, right? For example, if someone's witnessing domestic violence in their household or witnessing violence in their streets, whatever, or the witnessing doesn't even have to be in person, right? It could be like watching media. If somebody's seeing members of their own community be victims of police brutality in the news, that is traumatic to them and their body and their minds, right? That's secondary traumatic stress. Then we have traumatic separation. Now, this is trauma that's happening when a person is unexpectedly separated from their family, often forcibly. For example, in detention centers in the South, when families are coming to seek asylum, a lot of people, a lot of kids are being separated from their parents. That's traumatic to those kids. Another example is because of COVID, there's like lockdowns in place. So some people could be stuck because of the travel ban. Parents might be in another state or kids, and they're not having access to go back to each other, right? Or maybe someone's stuck in another country and because of like the travel restrictions, not able to visit. Or newborns that might have been born during COVID might have to be separated from their mothers because a mother might have tested positive, right? So these are very traumatic to children, especially younger children. So that is an example of traumatic separation, basically unexpected separation or forced separation. Then we have traumatic grief. Similarly, traumatic grief is grief that is traumatic because it's abrupt and unexpected loss, right? We're not just mourning someone's loss, but we're traumatized by it. We didn't expect this person to go so soon, right? For example, again, because of COVID, the last time somebody saw Aunt Hilda was when they were leaving her at the hospital. They didn't expect not to see her again. They didn't expect that they couldn't say goodbye, right? Not being able to process that loss the way we would normally do, it can lead to somebody being traumatized by that loss. And there could be survivor's guilt, having thoughts of, oh, if only did this, did that, right? Those are very much traumas that can impact. And somebody, or again, a community doesn't necessarily just have experience one type of trauma, they could experience multiple types of trauma, right? And by the way, these are traumas that any community can face, right? Anybody can face these, any community, any neighborhood. But we have specific traumas that are experienced over and over by BIPOC communities. Anybody heard of like historic trauma? Anyone heard of historic trauma or ancestral trauma? Maybe generational curses sometimes, right? So these are traumas that a certain ethnic group is facing over and over that maybe other counterparts, their other counterparts are not experiencing them. It's specifically to that group, right? Historically. The current traumas experienced by BIPOC communities. First up, we have systemic racism. So this one's tough because it's systemic at large. You can't just go to a mental health therapist and be like, hey, trauma is fixed, right? Because this is not just somebody being discriminated, because they didn't get a job because of the type of hair they had, but this is more like policies and procedure, like, everywhere. It's like ingrained in the system, whether it's in our healthcare system, whether it's in our political system, whether it's in our education system, right? systemic issues of the way things are practiced. These are institutions that harm certain racial groups and perpetuate that system, right? So that's systemic racism. And like mentioned, part of historical trauma, those communities have already previously experienced so many other things. Then we have fear of deportation. Fear of deportation. So if somebody doesn't have certain paperwork that the government or needs, or certain professional institutions like the banks need it, they constantly have to live in fear of being sent back, being exported, like deported, right? So being mindful that living with this on a daily basis, like, hey, I don't know if today's the day somebody finds out, today is the day something happens. Having to live in that stress and fear on a daily basis really adds mental stress. And here's the thing with stress, overexposure to stress, like constant, like prolonged stress, the body reads that as trauma. The physical body responds. And trauma, by the way, when we say things like, oh, generational curses and things like that, trauma, by the way, actually lives in our DNA. Trauma can get written in the DNA and be genetically passed down to our children. Like, this is a thing, right? Then we're seeing racial profiling and excessive police force. Now, we might recognize, okay, not all police are bad. We might have family members or people that we know are officers, and they're not bad people. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about racial profiling. Again, we're talking about the systemic, the institutions that have, again, using excessive force in certain areas or heavy policing, right? Again, we're talking about policies within the nation's police force that specifically harm certain racial groups or certain neighborhoods, right? So that, again, experienced by those communities, and hence why we're seeing excessive, constant imagery of these violence in our media. And so in light of recent events, there are many local governments that are engaging in like police reform, and they're trying to limit these instances. In New York State, for example, Governor Cuomo signed, say, their name reform agenda in an attempt to reduce that inequality and reimagine what the state's criminal system could look like, right? And I know, by the way, I just want to take a moment. I know I'm talking about a lot of heavy things. You're free to ask me questions, but I do want to be mindful. If any moment you're not comfortable, you want to reach out. Mimi is here in the chat. You could always chat with Mimi. Mimi could also share NYC Wells phone numbers. If anybody wanted to call, we do have 24/7 helpline if anyone needs emotional support during these times, all right? But we'll share resources throughout as well, okay? Basically, what we're going through right now is just acknowledging, like, hey, BIPOC communities have faced a lot. There's a lot on our plates, right? And even when we tell them, hey, what's the solution? Go get mental health. Well, let's talk about that. Let's see what happens when we try to access mental health, right? Barriers. Are there barriers in seeking mental health? What do you guys think? I want to open the floor. Do you guys think there are barriers or limitations?
Definitely.
Yes, yes. Let's talk about that. Give us examples.
One stigma is that somebody is going to think that you're psycho.
Oh, yeah.
That's one of the things. Oh, they'll think I'm a crazy person. Just because
Right.
you're seeking mental health does not mean that you're a crazy person. It means you're going through some stuff that you really need help getting through.
Exactly, right? Like, people question someone's mental capacity, or like, because, yeah, absolutely, right? People think you're crazy. For example, like, if you had a physical injury, right, and you call work, you need to take a couple of days off because, I don't know, you hurt your arm or something, and you call your supervisor, like, hey, I need a couple of days off, I can't do this. They're going to be super supportive. They're like, yeah, take the time off. They might send you a get well soon card or something like that. But would you be comfortable calling the supervisor, be like, you're feeling depressed, you need a couple days? Would you feel comfortable saying that? No, because now it's like your job may be in question. They'll be like, is this person even, competent enough to do their job, right? So that stigma, the way people perceive people with mental health issues as weak. Like, hey, just because I go to a physical therapist doesn't mean I'm physically weak. I just need help in certain areas, right? It doesn't, absolutely, right? So that stigma is there. Anybody else? What do you guys think are barriers when it comes to seeking mental health?
Well, we come from a Christian background. And I think not only just because we're Christians or we come from this background, I think when you are, associated with any faith-based belief, when you are seeking additional help, it's always like, it's not valued in a sense. It's almost like you don't need help, or just pray it away. And sometimes some of our issues, it requires a little bit more than prayer. I always say you can love Jesus and have a therapist too, So I think part of that is being afraid to get judged or viewed upon a certain way by the church, or, whatever religious organization you're with, because as Christians, we're not supposed to have any issues. You know what I mean? So we just stay quiet because we don't want to get judged, and we don't want to get, viewed as differently.
Right. Absolutely. It's absolutely. Yeah, it's like seen as like a weakness in faith almost. Like if you're having issues, that means you're not praying enough, right? But like you mentioned, we could do both. We could do the prayers and we could still seek professional help, because just like with physical health, right? If we had a physical health issue, we'd still go to the doctor, we'd continue praying. It doesn't mean it's either or, right? Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, these are very good, things that, very good examples of the barriers that people face in our communities. And other barriers that we're seeing is the lack of health insurance, right? We're seeing 11% of African Americans do not have health insurance. And even when people do, even when people have health insurance, are mental health providers always covered? Not necessarily. A lot of insurances have high co-payments. And if not, also we somewhat to an extent in New York City, we do have a lot more resources, but in other states, sometimes getting a mental health provider can be very challenging, right? We're seeing that we have to go far, travel far, might not have access to somebody at all. Language barriers in immigrant populations, their immigration status, again, like we talked about, paperwork, socioeconomic status, lack of trust in the healthcare system. That's a big one. Historically, the healthcare system wasn't always made inclusive for communities of color, right? For BIPOC communities, there have been straight up disbelief in their symptoms, not believing, or sometimes literally blaming a community. Oh, you have this problem, you're responsible for it, rather than treating it or working with it, right? So they have not had a great, history together. So of course that makes it challenging for people to go trust them, because especially when it comes to mental health, it's about being open and vulnerable with so much going on. And if your provider is not, like if this is a provider not from your community, do not know the backgrounds of the historical trauma or other things that you might be experiencing, that can be very hard, because that again put burden on the person seeking help to figure out, to explain to the provider like, hey, my community goes through this, right? So absolutely, these are very much things that impact, and when it comes to even dealing with our traumas, right? All right, so let's talk about what can we do. So we have here a list of resources that are specifically, this list was made for BIPOC communities. First up, oh, thank you, Mimi. I just noticed Mimi shared, oh, let me just check the chat. Mimi, thank you so much for sharing everything. Oh, I just saw a message from Lexi to start with a prayer. I am so sorry. I missed that text in time. I apologize. But we should definitely have prayer at the end, all right? We should definitely do that. I apologize for missing that because I just had the presentation open. But thank you so much for asking. Yes, we will definitely come back to that one. All right, so BIPOC communities, mental health resources during COVID. Inclusivetherapist.com. This is a website it's a very robust, it's a search engine. You could search by zip code, like what specific type of therapy you're looking for. If you have faith-based, if you're looking for a Christian therapist, they also offer in multiple languages. So the website can translate you to like Spanish, I don't know, French, whatever it is you might require. Then you have Black Mental Health Alliance. Again, as the name suggests, it's specifically for the Black mental health community. This website is more so designed for clinicians than for the public, but you can use it as a person of the public as well. There is a directory. But if you, let's say you're going to a provider and you want them, even if you're a PCP and you want them to refer you to a Black mental health provider, you can tell your PCP like, hey, maybe this could be useful for them, right? But also there is a directory of Black psychiatrists on that website. I see somebody has raised a hand. Did somebody have a question? Joseph? I don't know if that was intentional, but Joseph, if you want to ask a question, feel free to do so.
Yeah, just wanted to know if we will get access to the slides.
Yes, we can send you the slide after. If you just hang around, or if you put your email in the chat or hang around at the end of it, we will make sure we can send you an email with all the PDF, like we'll send a PDF of the slides, but also the resources are being shared actively. If anybody wants the slides to be emailed to them, you could just put your email in the chat and we'll collect a list towards the end. All right. Thank you for that question, Joseph. And all right, so where were we? Okay, yeah. So then we have Latinx therapy. Latinx therapy is a national network, again, specifically for the Latin community. They're culturally attuned. They have a lot of religious resources as well, right? Because we know the Latin community, they offer bilingual resources. There's a lot of information on that website. So it's not just about finding therapists of that background, but also information and how to explain certain things maybe to your family. Then we have Asian Mental Health Collective, right? So again, their goal is to destigmatize mental health in Asian communities. And this is a network of Asian mental health providers in the States as well as Canada. They also have a lot of hotlines and directories for internationally. So if people have family members back home, they do have like hotlines that they could use on an international basis. Okay. And all right, so let's transition onto how has COVID impacted mental health, right? Let's look at that specifically. So we're seeing that COVID has impacted mental health. We're seeing an increased rates in anxiety, depression, stress, right? Substance use, domestic violence as well. So when it comes to domestic violence, I want to mention if anyone's experiencing or knows somebody it is, I want to share the resource for NYC Hope, right? NYC Hope, their number will be shared in the chat. Thank you. I think Mimi might have already shared it, so thank you for that. And NYC Hope is a resource of if anything is obviously extremely emergency, you do want to call 911 for that, right? Just to support a person and their family through the severity of their situation. Other than that, we're seeing an increase in anxiety, depression as well, right? And we're seeing a decrease in daily functioning. And sometimes we might not have seen the symptoms right away. Maybe when the March, April, we didn't see it because things just started to change. But over time, now that it's like month 6, 7, we're going into it, right? We're still in quarantine. We're still seeing people impact. So sometimes we might see these symptoms come on later on. We want to be mindful of that.
I have a question for you, Malia.
Yes.
I know that, this mostly goes for adults, but children, doesn't this affect them with depression and all that other
Yes,
stuff
100%.
too?
So we definitely have seen, like as somebody who works, yeah, we've definitely seen behavioral health issues increase even for children.
Okay.
So 100% acknowledging that this specific presentation is targeted because it's like an hour long. It's
Mhm.
for the general public completely. So
Okay.
this doesn't include children's statistics. It's like adults across the nation.
But they do have specific
Yes.
lines that would
There.
be for behavioral.
I know because I do not teach the children's class. I mean, we don't have one yet. I think it's still in the works. But
Okay.
if you are interested, you can feel free to email the coordinator for this,
Mhm.
and they would try to connect you. But there has been an increase, yes. As far as we know, there has been reported increase in children's behavioral health issues
Got you.
because of COVID, because of like quarantine, having to stay home, not seeing their
Yeah.
friends, food insecurities and everything. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just this presentation wasn't targeted towards it, but absolutely we have seen impact.
Got you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that question though. Yeah,
No
absolutely.
problem. Thank you.
And all right, so we were talking about the national anxiety rates and depression rates by race and ethnicity. So if you take a look at this slide is showing us that we're seeing higher rates of depression or anxiety in communities that are multiple races, which means like they could be biracial, followed by Hispanic Latinos, followed by non-Hispanic Blacks, right? So again, we're seeing that higher impact in BIPOC communities. Now, a couple of things to also remember that this is based on what people are reporting, right? This is literally based on what people are reporting. And do you think everyone is comfortable reporting this? Not always, right? Not always everyone's reporting. And not we've also hadn't always had data in terms of what was people's mental health before COVID versus now, right? Like the people who are reporting it. So these are things that can impact the data, and it could be truly, it could be much higher. We don't know. Now, here's something we're seeing, reported cause of anxiety, depression, right? Things that have impacted both of these. What? The number one reason, isolation, quarantining, not being able to go out to work, see family. That has been the biggest contributor to the increased rates of depression and anxiety. Almost twice as likely. We're seeing 72% of people said isolation and loneliness was a huge factor in their depression as compared to COVID concerns or grief and loss. Those are also things that impacted it, COVID, and the way we're processing COVID. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about grief and loss. How has COVID impacted our mourning and loss, the process we go through, right? So we understand grief to be it's a natural response to losing somebody or something that might be important to us. We all grieve for our personal losses. And what's interesting is, even though, especially as New Yorkers, we see so many cultures and communities and everybody processes grief differently. But one thing that's common across is we all come together. No matter what community you are from, what immigrant population, what language you speak, the one thing that everybody processes called grief together, every culture, is people coming together, right? Whether that's families or neighborhood. And that's been one thing that COVID has taken away for us, right? Social distancing has been really challenging in terms of how people get together and process their losses. Social distance has definitely impacted that. We're seeing it's disrupted our funeral arrangements, having to have virtual rituals. So whether it's a virtual, funeral where people are watching through Zoom, or sometimes it's like, I know some churches have had services, memorial services where people had like drive-throughs, right? But either way, it's that physical distance that sometimes we just need a person's presence, even if it's not necessarily a family, just having someone's physical presence there can be healing. And that's something that's been something a lot of us are struggling with now, right? The way we grieve greatly impacted by COVID. Okay, so now just again, we just want to honor that. These are things that COVID has definitely, exposed us to new struggles that we didn't always think of. So we're going to now talk about how do we process it? How do we build resilience? Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. While I'm going to talk about self-care, we're going to talk about resilience. This is in no way saying, hey, we're going to just, put on a face mask and we're going to deal with systemic racism, right? The reality is this is not just a conversation, it's just a conversation starter. We're barely touching the surface here, right? Keeping in mind, I'm not dismissing the experiences we're going on in a systemic basis. There's a lot of work to be done. But we want to be mindful of how do we sustain ourselves on a day-to-day basis? How do we take care of ourselves, right? A lot of us are probably like very giving personalities, always there for our communities, especially if it's part of a church community. But remembering that there's only so much we can give, right? We can't pour from a glass that's empty, right? Remembering to reset, remembering to refill our energy so we can continue giving on a more sustainable way. So let's talk about resilience. Actually, let's open the floor. When you guys hear the word resilience, what do you think it means? What does the word resilience mean? What comes to your mind?
You're tough.
You're tough. You're strong.
Yeah.
But what does tough mean? What do we mean when we say, oh, this person's really strong?
Means that you could take on a lot or be going through a lot and still smiling, and no one would know that you're literally dying on the inside.
Absolutely, right? This person who can like take it all, right?
Yeah,
They might
smiling, carrying on. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we might admire people for their resilience, sometimes they still need support. Does that mean they're immune to problems? They don't have problems, they don't need support?
They
No,
definitely
100%
need
they
the
do.
support.
Exactly. So recognizing that while resilience is something, we admire, that it shouldn't ever limit us from being there for people, being caring and being conscious, right? And also just because somebody is not always like they look strong, like they look like they have it together and they're smiling, doesn't mean they're not resilient, right? Everybody processes differently. Like the way some people process grief is they need to talk about it, they need to vent. Some people process grief by staying silent, they need space, right? So everybody is resilient differently, but just being mindful of how we support each other. So absolutely, right? Resilience is their ability to cope or like adapt to a certain adversity, a certain stressor. And speaking of coping, I want to ask you guys, this year it's been stressful, right? What are things you guys have done? What are some coping methods you've come up with? I want to open the floor. What are ways you are using to cope by yourself or maybe your family, whatever that looks like?
Cooking a lot.
Cooking, yes. I love cooking. Well, I love people who cook because I love to eat. Right? Cooking is great. I've been picking up a lot of quarantine cooking as well because I didn't always have time before, but now that I'm home more, yes, cooking.
Going for
Anybody else?
walks. Going for
Going
walks.
for walks. Yeah. I think before we used to walk a lot. Well, I used to walk a lot, but it was always for work and stuff. So it was like going somewhere. But now it's like just strolling, just like looking around, right? Yeah. So it definitely offers perspective.
Journaling for me.
Ooh, journaling. That's a really good one. Do you like bullet journal or just regular journaling?
It depends. Usually either bullet or sometimes a guided journal with, certain questions, guided writing, things of that nature.
That's awesome. Yeah, journaling is great. It's a great way to have, your thoughts written out. It helps sleeping, by the way. So if you are one of those people that have like restless sleeping at night, sometimes because a lot is going on in your mind, you can highly recommend just keeping a notebook by your bed and just writing it out. Free write. Nobody has to read that. You can literally burn the book later, but it can really help the mind. What the mind, it's like once it's tangibly out, it can give it some peace to sleep on. Yes, I see somebody's nodding.
It doesn't help.
It doesn't help. Oh no.
No, I'm chronic insomniac. It does not help at all.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
I usually just lay there till I fall. I'm just letting you know that it doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah, no, absolutely, right? Like, of course, like different things work with different people, different bodies and minds. Absolutely. And thank you for sharing, though. Yeah, of course. I mean, even when we go through coping strategies, whatever it is, it doesn't always work for everyone. Different things work for everybody, right? So it's like learning what works for you. Like, I will be like, hey, practice mindfulness. I know mindfulness or like meditation is great for a lot of people, but I also know people for whom meditation actually gave them anxiety. That could also happen. Yeah, I know. So for what happens to meditation, again, it's a great way to, learn, get in touch with your body and mind and like breathing exercises. And for the most part, it is very beneficial, especially with anxiety, it does help. But in case of depression, meditation might not always be recommended for people struggling with depression, because again, it requires you to sit with your thoughts. And if your thoughts are not in the best place, it can actually make it worse, right? So definitely, if something doesn't work, you don't want to keep doing that, right? Step back. If you're talking to a mental health provider, definitely want to tell them like, hey, I don't think this is helping me, right?
Definitely good to know.
Yeah. But again, I'm not discouraging trying it. Like, of course, feel free to try them. If it doesn't work, that's okay too. You don't have to be hard on yourself. Like, why is this not working for me? Right? Yeah. But yeah, speaking of resilience, things that can help build resilience or characteristics, right? One thing is accepting. Accepting can be very easy to say, but hard to do. It's like accepting reality can be challenging. It's not always easy. It can be dark, right? But one thing to understand is the sooner we just like accept reality, then we learn how to work with it, right? Managing our expectations. I think 2020 has taught us this the hard way. We don't, each month comes around and we're all on our edge of our seats like, well, November is coming around soon, so we don't know what that's going to bring, right? So expectations, managing them, understanding how to work through those, staying in touch with family and friends. Our support systems are very crucial in terms of our resilience, right? We're social beings. We're not designed to take it all on one person, right? It's important for us to be dependent, well, not dependent, but to be able to rely on people that we trust and around us, right? On our communities. That's why humans have always existed in communities or tribes. We spoke about mindfulness, showing compassion to yourself. This one can be really hard. We're here for everybody else. Like, if you're having a bad day, I'm okay. It's okay. Things are hard. It's not easy. Look at the economy. It's bad. But if you feel the same way, we don't tell ourselves that. We're just like, come on, right? I got to figure this out. I can't. But literally imagine yourself as your friend. Like I tell that, like when people are mean to themselves, like, would you tell this to your friend? No, you wouldn't. So why do you allow yourself to tell it to yourself, right? Imagine yourself in third person, and if everything you're going through, there's a lot going on right now, literally a pandemic, a global pandemic. It is extremely stressful. So for all of us, even if we don't personally feel like things have changed, our bodies feel it, right? This is not normal for our bodies to feel it. So it can be responding to trauma, and it's okay. And then lastly, staying optimistic. This can be hard, challenging, even for myself. I'm not always the most, happy-go-lucky, optimistic person, but recognizing that it's not a permanent thing, right? Like the pandemic, we're all working towards as humans. One thing we've always had, especially as New Yorkers, we've been through so much. And one way we experience it is together, right? We figure it out. And so this will also be something we figure it out as a community. So speaking of resilience, how do we support others? How do we support somebody who is grieving? Now, everything you see on the screen is coming from a place with the best intentions, right? But sometimes it might not be super helpful or supportive to hear it, right? Imagine you are going through something, a loss, a grief, maybe you lost your job or something like that, and somebody is like, everything happens for a reason. And it could be sometimes dismissive because at that moment you're hurting. In that moment you're hurting and you're trying to process this, right? So instead, we want to focus on the person who needs that attention. What are they going through? Show empathy. And empathy is just acknowledging. It doesn't mean you have to you have to be in their shoes, but just like understanding that this is difficult and just acknowledging and allow them to process it however it may be. Like I mentioned, sometimes some people want space, so respect it, give them that space. Sometimes people need time, so don't rush their process. If they need time, be like, okay, I'll be here however you need me, right? So grieving can look different for different people. And you just want to acknowledge and be there in whatever capacity you can, right? Now, all these ways we're talking about supporting, sometimes coping strategies can be unhealthy, right? First up, we have overexposure to media. Who's guilty of this one? Overexposure to media, constantly watching the news every minute, every day. I need updates. What's the newest policy? What did Florida say? What did Texas do? Right? What's November going to look like? When is the vaccination coming? So being mindful that this might be information we want, this can be impacting us negatively again, right? Our minds constantly having that negative news input can be very harmful as well. So I was very guilty of this, especially in the beginning of the pandemic. I was super glued to the screen. So having to be mindful and watch myself and like take a step back, like, okay, I need to slow down. I need to recognize that, hey, this is not healthy for me, and just limit it to once a week, or maybe like I only find out through friends and not directly, right? Misuse of alcohol or other substances, we're seeing increased reports of consumption of alcohol or other substances. And again, this is not to say don't have a drink here and there, but sometimes because now we tend to be quarantined, we're by ourselves, so maybe there's nobody else watching us, right? Sometimes in social settings, we're more mindful of how much we're drinking, but because of quarantine, we don't know what our friends or neighbors are doing, right? So definitely want to turn on that radar when you're talking to them, or also like minding your own, intake. Unnecessary spending, Amazon.com. Yes, right. It's so nice. It's like Christmas every day. You can just open things, put things in your cart, and 2 days later, it's at your doorstep. You don't even need a treat right now. You just open that box. I'm like, whoa. Sometimes I like to surprise myself, right? But yeah, that can also be a coping strategy that's not always healthy, right? Especially if somebody is financially struggling, it might not be the best way at the moment. And lastly, we're seeing risky or destructive behaviors. This is when we're seeing, especially with a pandemic, we're seeing people who are like, well, everyone's going to get COVID at some point. What's the point of the mask, right? I might as well get it. Putting themselves at risk, but also others, right? So that's like a safety concern. So these are ways people might be coping, but not the healthiest way. And in these cases, we definitely want to have a conversation with this person. And we'll talk about how we have that in a little bit. So let's talk about how do we want to help ourselves? What are appropriate or healthier ways that we can help ourselves and others? Staying connected with your support systems. Like I mentioned, we're in quarantine. When we were not in quarantine before COVID, right? One of the ways we kept in touch with people, we saw body language tells us a lot of what someone's going through, right? But now our interaction is limited to that phone call, FaceTime, Zoom, whatever it is, right? So it's harder. So instead, you want to have more frequent calls if you can and just be accountable, like, hey, what's going on? But also holding yourself accountable, right? Like having that weekly chat, Zoom, whatever it looks like. Self-help books. Ooh, this is a good one. Actually, in the chat, I want you guys to take time in the chat. Recommend if anybody's ever read a self-help book that really made an impact. Why would you like to share in the chat? And I'll come to it later and talk. We'll see what we come up with. If you have a self-help book that you really like, put it in the chat. So let's go through some other strategies. Sunlight, yeah, I know people mentioned walking. Sunlight is great, super underrated. Sunlight gives us vitamin D, gives us energy levels. Asking for help. Again, a reminder, we are going through very challenging times, whether or not we realize it, our bodies do, and it's okay to ask for help. It's perfectly acceptable. And we'll share some numbers you can call if you don't want to ask your own family. Maybe you're not as comfortable, your community. There are online resources that we could share. And also, you could be the person that is the support system for people. Be that person that people can reach out to, people can rely on, right? Becoming a community advocate, starting a Facebook group, right? If you're the tech savvy person, setting up that Zoom call. These are definitely ways we could all help support each other and also ourselves. So self-care tips. Okay, a lot of this we touched on the earlier side, right? Staying connected, exercising, journaling, cookbooks. Absolutely. One thing that has helped people, especially working from home and remotely, is like creating routines, because it can be very hard when you're in the same environment. Like you finish work, you're home, but you're working, and then it's like it gets convoluted, right? And creating a schedule, like these are hours I work. After that, close the computer, right? Things like that can really help again, differentiate for the mind and body. All right, so now we're sharing some apps. These are apps that you can find on the Play Store or the App Store. So these are free mental health apps. Some of them are free only during COVID specifically, but they're free regardless at the moment, right? These are great apps recommended by New York City Well. I'll touch on New York City Well a little bit. These are apps by professionals, like professional psychologists have been licensed on these apps. So for anxiety, we have Shine, Calm, and Ginger. Especially Calm is a specific app that helps with mindfulness. YSAT and Senvelo, these are apps for depression. I've used both of them. They're really good. It's like you're talking to a robot, like it's like a chat with an AI. And based on what you tell, based on like, oh, I'm struggling with this, they give you very personal recommendation and strategies that can work specifically for you. And similar sleep, it helps track your sleep. Along with that, it also gives you strategies. Now, a couple of words on the apps. These are apps that, this is just some of the apps. There's a bigger list that you can find on NYC Well app library. Oh, I think Mimi might have shared it in the chat. So thank you for that, Mimi. And you can, on that website, you can sort through like age. So if you're working with underaged or minors, you can go to under 18. There's specific apps for them. You can also sort through like symptoms specifically, what a person is struggling with, maybe it's substance use, things like that. So these are various ways you can, you know, if somebody, again, because a lot of times we might say, go on therapy, right? Call this number. But let's say somebody's home is what's causing them stress, right? They can't always go on a phone call and express themselves openly. So having text chat services or apps could be a better resource for them. When do we seek help? Ooh, this is a good one. When do we seek help? When do you know someone's just, what's the difference between someone just having a bad day versus somebody who needs mental health help? How do you know? You don't? Okay. Has anybody here taken our mental health first aid class? Mental health first aid? Anybody? Okay, I see a hand. Yes? Okay. Do you remember what our 4 L's were? The 4 L's.
Live, laugh, love, and learn.
Oh my God, amazing. Thank you for that, Joseph. You're the first person. I've taught this class a few weeks now. No one's get it. Live, love, laugh, and learn. It's so brilliant. I don't know who your instructor was. They did a great job. Yes, yes. Thank you. Yes, so you're live, love, laugh, and learn. Go, Joseph. Yes. Okay. So those are, it's a way for you to see if somebody is, it's like a marker, it's a tool to see how somebody's doing. So your live, love, laugh, and learn. Let me break it down. Living is your daily activities. You're going to work, you're going to school, and or like, you know, eating, sleeping, hygiene, daily functioning, right? Your love is your relationships. How are you feeling about your relationships? How are you treating, how others are treating you? Learning, right? Learning is like we're learning in this environment today, but also like building memories with family and friends. That's memory learning. And then laughing is to enjoy things, to, you know, enjoy cooking, love eating, love drawing, your hobbies, or not liking things, not having interest. Oh, this is not my type of music, right? Things like that. These are your daily functioning, your 4 Ls. We all have our 4 Ls. When you start seeing an impact in one of these, that might be time somebody needs help. Now, again, like I mentioned, somebody can have a bad day or even a bad week. But if you're seeing week 2, week 3, week 4, things are progressively getting worse. They don't enjoy talking about the things they do or don't talk much even, right? That's a sign that there might be something going on.
Isolation.
Yeah, isolation. And that's the other thing, you know, even though I'm on this slide as well, you're seeing sleeping, eating. Now, if you're not living with this person in isolation, you're not going to see their sleeping patterns or eating patterns, right? So that's where you're focusing on conversation. Are they not engaging as much? Are they, maybe they've missed a book club meeting, right? So like, let's say you have to tell this person, right? Now you have a friend or a family member that's going through this and you're like, I think they need help. So how do you have that conversation? So be like, hey, Sarah, I don't know if there's a Sarah in this class right now. So it's hypothetical Sarah. So like, hey, Sarah, I've noticed you haven't been joining our book club Zoom calls every week. Is everything okay? Right? So you address that person, bring up what you've noticed, whatever it is you've noticed that's not how they normally are, not their typical behavior, and then follow up with a question that's open ended, like, hey, what's going on? Is there something going on? You know, just let them talk out because you're just offering that space. And
Watch
depending,
the approach too. Some might get a bit
uncomfortable.
uncomfortable. Say, why are you questioning me? Why you're in my space? So you got to be mindful of
Right.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So of course we want to be mindful, but I'm just encouraging, how do you even open that space to begin with? Because
In the
some people might be like,
conversation.
because sometimes people might not even feel, but they're like, oh, maybe they don't want to share, they don't want to tell me, but we should still take the first step of just asking. If they get defensive, that's okay, but we've done our role as somebody who cares, is like, hey, let's open the floor, like, hey, I've noticed A, B, and C, is everything okay? And if they get defensive, just be like, hey, I'm just, I want to support you. If there's something, maybe again, like an example is the book club thing, right? They're not coming to the club meetings that they used to. Be like, hey, if something's going on, can we maybe we should change times, maybe like see if you can offer a solution for them that helps them. But if not, depending on that conversation, depending on the flow, which can be very different from person to person, you might be noticing something, whether or not they're defensive. You might notice they open up like, oh, this is happening,
Yeah.
or them getting defensive, right? What we want to be mindful is, obviously it doesn't lead to a potential crisis, right? I think I saw a hand. Joseph? Yes, did you have a question as well?
Yes, I just wanted to comment. I think it's important to preface that conversation, like before we say, I've noticed, we can tell them how much we care about them, just letting them know I really care about you and your well-being. And then we can say, I've noticed, such and such. Because I think if
Yeah.
we say it initially, it may help them to be less defensive. They know we're coming from a good place.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent idea. Right. So if you suspect this person get defensive, definitely you could just be like, hey, definitely care for you. And this is why I'm asking this, absolutely. That's a really excellent idea. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And just keeping in mind, because we're just doing precautions, right? Sometimes there's nothing wrong. Maybe they're just busy, and that's fine too. But you would rather ask somebody and find out they're busy than don't ask them and then something else happens, right? because that could also happen. Now, speaking of, what are resources? Like, let's say, again, like I said, if it's something small, you can ignore it. But at the same time, if it's something they need help, what can we do? What are resources we have? So here we have resources for emotional support, specifically because of COVID. First up, we have the New York State COVID Emotional Support Helpline. This is set up by Governor Kumar earlier this year. I know, I don't know if we have call-in users, but I'll just read out the numbers. So the number for this is 1-844-863-9314. Again, that's 844-863-9314. They have free mental health counseling, information about COVID and where to get tested, and other resources. All right. The next resource is NYC Well. This is specific to New York City residents. Again, free, confidential, 24/7 hotline. They have over 200 languages. Excuse me, sorry. So they're trained professionals. And one thing about NYC Well is they provide other resources. So you don't necessarily have to just call for mental health, but they have other resources. They also have this thing called mobile crisis units. Mobile crisis units. So let's say you want to do a welfare check. Does anyone know what a welfare check is?
Yeah, that's when you make a call and they have a professional or somebody come to the home and check the situation,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Absolutely, right? So maybe you're concerned for somebody who might be in another borough and you can't visit them. You can call a professional service they're going to be mental health professionals. So it's not like police or anything, but they're just responders who will like go knock on their door and just check like, hey, how are you doing, right? So this is in case you feel like somebody just needs that visit. So NYC Well does that. The only thing is this is not an emergency number, because in case of an emergency, you still want to call 911. Because NYC Well can take up to 2 days to show up to that person's house. If it is a younger person, like if this is a minor under 18, I think they have a more faster service. But at the same time, do not rely on them for emergency. NYC Well, the one other good thing is because it's a free service. So if somebody's undocumented, they're not comfortable sharing that, you can still use the service because it is anonymous. They'll need a name and address obviously to come, but they don't keep they do not check like immigration status in terms of giving care. So that's NYC Well. Their number is 1-888-692-9355. Again, that's 1-888-692-9355. You can also chat with them on their website, nyc.gov/nycwell, or text with them. You can text the word well, WELL, to 65173. By the way, you guys are all welcome to like take screenshots or anything. I know some of you put your email, so we'll definitely send you a PDF, but you're also welcome to take screenshots. It's okay. All right. So our next resource is the New York State Office of Addiction Service Supports Hopeline. So this is specifically for issues that somebody might need substance use care, or they have problems with gambling, sorry. Their number is 1-877-846-7369. That's 1-877-846-7369. And then we have the Trevor Project. It is again free, confidential line for youth that are LGBTQ and need mental health support. Their number is 1-866-488-7386. Now, I know this is not a youth class, but one thing to do with youth is even if they don't want to talk to you, just let them have these numbers. Like, hey, this is a free anonymous line if you ever need it. Just in case if they do ever need somebody to turn to and they don't feel comfortable, having that number can help them just, have something for them in case if a situation comes up. And our next resource is specifically from the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. So here we have this website, newyorkcity.gov/health/COVID resources. So what happens on this website is when you go on it, you can break it down by borough, and within each borough, it has zip codes. And once you click on a specific zip code, you get a list of like health services, any clinics, food banks, any food services, translation, immigration, like specific resources in that neighborhood. So this is like how they have sorted this website. It can be very helpful. All right, I know we're okay. So recapping, we're basically at our 1 hour mark. So let's recap everything we talked about today, right? COVID changed our lives, right? We've all been impacted at some level, major changes on a global scale. And it has impacted our mental health. We're seeing, again, it has impacted anxiety, depression, systemic inequities. It's only highlighted them. A lot of these inequities have always existed. Oh, COVID has just highlighted. We talked about prioritizing self-care, staying resilient, right? And shared a lot of resources, which I hope you guys found useful. And now comes my favorite part. This is a poem, an excerpt from a poem by the incredible Maya Angelou. I'm going to read this. So it says, "You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise." So our hearts may carry a heavy burden, but we need to believe that collectively we will lift ourselves up again. We are New Yorkers. We have shown great strength previously in getting through tough times, and there is no question that we will do it again together, right? With that being said, I would like to open up the floor for everyone. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, and how did you guys like this? Thank you all. You guys were great participants, by the way, very engaged. And also Mimi, I don't know if you wanted to check in terms of registration or anything. I don't know if there's a way to unmute everybody. But
Yes. There's a one person I need to identify you because I couldn't find your name in our system. So obviously you haven't registered yet, but still welcome you to be here. So Basti, BASTI, could you please provide me with your phone number, email address, and your home zip code? Just the zip code. I do not need your mailing address. Okay, BASTI, B as a boy, A as apple, S as Sam, T as Tom, I.
Gosh.
And the lastly, memorials.
thank you. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, just because we are having registered, we just want everybody's name registered. So Basti Morales, you don't even have to say it to everybody. You could just privately chat Mimi with
Yeah,
that information.
yeah,
Just your
you
email
send
and
me
yeah,
individually.
yeah,
And
you could individually send it to her so nobody else has necessarily
and
has to see that.
also for those people who love to have our PowerPoints for today's conversation, I have already sent you the email.
Got
So
it
please
already.
keep an eye on your email.
Got it
Oh wow,
already.
wonderful.
Got
Mimi
it
is
already.
amazing. That was fast. Okay, thank you, Mimi.
She's quick.
Yeah, that was really quick. So yes, if you haven't received the PDF or if you would still like to receive the copy of these slides, you can message Mimi and she'll be happy to send it over. All right, with that being said, if anybody has any questions, by the way, anything else that you guys want to talk about, any concerns, yeah, the floor is yours. If not, I would definitely like to go back to Lexi. We definitely want to have that prayer. That again, I apologize, I missed that text. Yes.
Quick question, Malia. Do you know if they're offering any train the trainer for virtual mental health first aid?
For mental health first aid, no. I believe there's a train the trainer for this specific, the community conversation one, but not for mental health first aid, not at the moment. Because we have put mental health first aid on hold for now, I think until next year for now, because this is a priority right now, like the COVID thing.
Got it. And who do I get in touch with if I'm interested in that one?
Let me send you my email. You can shoot me an email and I will forward it to the appropriate person. Just because I will also have to find out who exactly on the team is working with our trainers. All right,
Hey.
I just send my email on the chat. So you can feel free to take that. All right.
Yes, Kara.
Perfect. Now, while you guys do that, I want to thank, first of all, Malia and Mimi. Thank you guys so much for just taking the time to join us, and also those who were able to register that are live with us on Zoom. We'd like to thank you for joining, and I'm actually going to turn it over to Natalie, who will give us a few closing words right before we pray.
All right. Now, I guess at the beginning we went a bit too fast, but Malia, just so I don't butcher your last name, please repeat that for me.
Oh no, it's okay. My name is Maliha Fairuz.
Oh, gotcha.
Fairuz.
So
Yeah.
we want to thank Maliha Fairuz and Mimi Chang today for just coming on with us and giving us that little extra to understand, you know, how far mental health can go, what resources we can use to help out should we be presented with the issue, and again, to share it with the masses. This is something that, like we say, is stigma. You will not find a lot of people coming forward regardless. So we have to find ways. You said live, learn, love, and laugh. We have to find ways to reach our brothers and sisters who are in need. And sometimes we do have to get creative with that. But it's a beautiful thing, and I thank you ladies for just coming in, spending time and sharing with us. We appreciate it. We will definitely be using these tools as we go along.
Thank you so much for even having us. You guys were amazing.
We appreciate you.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. Now we're going to ask Katrina, who's on the line with us, if she could close us off with prayer.
Bow your heads and close your eyes for prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for all you've done for us. Thank you for the fact that we could still come together virtually and talk about mental health. We are aware that COVID impacted our communities and ourselves, and I pray that you help us in every way to move forward from this pandemic. Help every individual on this live. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.
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 Amen. Once again, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you to the Greater New York Conference, Queens AYLC 2020 candidates for putting this together. Once again, Willie and Mimi, thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you guys for watching, and have a good evening, everyone.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you for
Bye.
hosting us. Everybody, take care.